Hi, I'm Thomas Chatterton Williams.
And I'm Jeff Chatterton Maurer.
I'm a writer.
And I'm a comedian.
And we host a podcast called Wrongthink, more of a question than a comment.
In addition to being more of a question than a comment, it is also more of a podcast we want people to know about than just two guys talking into a microphone for no reason.
So we'd like to ask you to please subscribe to the show.
If you like the show, please share it with your friends. If you don't like the show, then please punish your enemies by sharing it with them.
And also, please rate us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Grindr. We got a lot of listeners on Grindr. The Wrongthink podcast. Thinking.
That's not our tagline.
Could be, though. Could be the tag. We'll talk about it offline. Thomas Chatterton Williams. Is it okay if I call you T-Chats Willytown?
I expect you to improve week in and week out. I want to see some, like we can start wherever, but I just have to see evidence of progress.
So is that a yes? I'd taken that as a yes.
Maybe you're just proving that persistence pays and you're just going to wear me down.
Okay, I won't call you that. TC Dubs, what is on your mind this week? What's going on?
Once again, I'm thinking about debates over wokeness, not even the content of the matter, but just the terminology. Conservative writer, she seems nice enough. I know she's like a lot of us, she's become controversial online over the years, and she's got her detractors and her points of view that drive people crazy. But interpersonally, I've only interacted with her online. Bethany Mandel, she seems like a nice enough person, and she went through a kind of experience that I think anybody who speaks publicly or goes on stage live or goes on TV, can empathize with. She froze up pretty badly on Brianna Joy Gray and Rabi Soave's Rising.
Of Americans consider themselves very liberal, and probably fewer of them consider themselves to be woke. And so, when we talk about traditional,
what does that mean to you? Would you mind defining woke? Because it's come up a couple times, and I just want to make sure we're on the same page.
So, woke is sort of the idea that this is going to be one of those moments that goes viral. Woke is something that's very hard to define, and we've spent an entire chapter defining it. It is sort of the understanding that we need to totally reimagine and redo society in order to create hierarchies of oppression. It's hard to explain in a 15-second soundbite.
Yeah, look, your time.
So, you catch her in the process. She's got a book that she co-authored that came out with a chapter devoted to critiquing wokeness. I'm also a critic of wokeness. It's a term I don't like to use when I'm critiquing the thing that it's applied to, but she's been critiquing it. She's been.
But how would you define it? Go. How would you define it right now?
So the first
in
thing
exactly 17 words.
The first thing I do when I define wokeness is I say it's a disputed term, and that's why I think it's not a useful term, because there's a subtle understanding of it, and there's a common understanding of it, and that works on both sides, whether you're a critic of it or an adherent of it. And so oftentimes people are talking past each other. People are using it as a rallying cry. People are talking about a set of values that they don't want to have locked down with a certain name. If you're on the left, if you're on the right, it's a pejorative. So I think it's actually counterproductive to making society better, whether you're on the left or the right, to rely on a kind of term that obfuscates more than it clarifies. But this is the world we live in. This is the term that we're stuck with, it seems. And, if you do use it, then you want to be able to, whether you have a definition people agree with or not, you want to be able to have a definition. And so she was kind of in the midst of talking about most liberals wouldn't call themselves woke. And Brianna simply said, can we just pause for a second and define what you mean by woke so we're all on the same page? And then it was kind of painful sputtering and, disintegration, where at one point Bethany acknowledged that this is one of those moments that's going to go viral. And it really did.
Yeah, which guaranteed that it would go viral.
Guaranteed.
If there was any chance before she said that it was not going to go viral, that chance went by the wayside. The second she started.
when you it's the Barbara Streisand effect. I've also been a victim of this as well. When you draw attention to the thing that you want to cover up, it's not.
Oh, and by the way, speaking of the Barbara Streisand effect, her book, not Barbara Streisand's book, Bethany Mandel's book, is now in the New York Times bestseller list because this clip went viral. So in the end, she's kind of going to win this.
Maybe I'm the one who's the fool.
Let me say that
I'm mistaken about this. Maybe at the end of the day, Donald Trump is the only person that ever understood media, and you just want to hit their name out there.
Yeah. Well, look, if she did orchestrate this, which she clearly did not, she would be. Maybe she is a genius playing three-dimensional chess, right? Because I certainly didn't know who. I never heard the name Bethany Mandel before the other day. I saw everyone dunking on her on Twitter. I watched the clip. I did just, as you said, anybody who speaks publicly has frozen. I have frozen on stage. I've forgotten jokes on stage. I've been in the middle of a joke and then realized, oh, I don't know how this goes anymore. I haven't told this one in a while. So on a human level, I just had empathy for her because she very clearly got brain lock. I don't know if it tells anything about, people are dunking on her going like, even people who write about wokeness can't define wokeness. Like, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Some people define it. I also don't use the term if I can ever avoid it because it is so vague, because it is so fuzzy. People on the right absolutely just use it as a proxy for like political attitudes I don't like. Mm-hmm. And then some people on the left will use it as a proxy for just like good stuff generally. It's so fuzzy, even fuzzier than the other terms we use. And I don't like it for that reason.
Absolutely. And there's a kind of thing that happens on the left, a kind of disingenuous game. And this is what frustrates critics of wokeness, where unlike socialism in the past or other movements, communism, the left has a kind of menu of, the far left has a kind of like menu of values or goals or attitudes that it refuses to apply a common term to so that people can effectively debate them. And it's not completely accidental, or that's how it feels from the outside. And so every time you try to name this thing, they say, that's not what we're doing. That's not what we believe. It's something else. But please articulate what that thing is that's happening everywhere in every institution that we're suffering through. So that is a valid critique of the idea of wokeness from the people that just want to say, I don't care what you call it, but slap a label on that thing because we need to talk about what's wrong.
Yes, but absolutely. I thought Freddie DeBoer had the definitive article on this, which I called it up while you were talking. It is titled, "Please just fucking tell me what term I'm allowed to use for the sweeping social and political changes you demand," which I think the title says it all. I think that captures what a lot of us are feeling. Yeah, just give it a name.
But when you do give it a name, you need to be able to say what you're talking about. And so, I mean, at some point, Bethany gathers herself enough to say that it's essentially an attempt to redo society into hierarchies of oppression. Not a satisfactory description of what wokeness is, but also not completely without logic. I mean, it is always, looking at social interactions and institutions through the lens of oppressors and oppressed, and with a kind of implicit goal of bringing into alignment those two groups through equity initiatives, affirmative action, what have you. So she's not completely wrong. That's just not enough of an answer. And what got me, and what we're really talking about here is what's irritating you this week. What got me is this kind of constant thing you see when you observe, when you're neither aligning yourself with the left or the right, and you're just kind of in the middle, trying to be as reasonable as any of us can in good faith. This horseshoe thing that happens where when she finally addresses what happened, and I retweeted this. I didn't want to pile on, and I still don't want to pile on. I mean, I really hate the feeling of freezing up. I'd rather be literally. I've been in fistfights and I've frozen up on stage in front of 500 people, and I'd prefer to be punched in the face than to freeze up on stage in front of 500.
Those are two. Just for clarity, those are different incidents, though. Correct?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
It wasn't some TED Talk gone horribly wrong, where in minute 5 you froze, and then in minute 7 you were in a fist fight. Two separate incidents per se.
No, so I don't have direct comparisons. There was some time between the two, but I would prefer to just take that punch.
I would agree with that. I have frozen on stage. I have almost cut my pinky finger off with a chisel. I'd say they're about the same. They're about the same. Yeah.
What I don't agree with, and then not to beat a dead horse, but Mandel gets on Twitter the next day and she says, not to make any excuses or whatever, but a bit of a backstory. just before we went on air, Brianna Joy Gray was on a hot mic. I heard her demeaning parenting in general in colorful and nasty terms, stating parents only have kids in order to perpetuate their own narcissism. Robbie responded, there are some good ones and some bad ones. As a mom of 6, including a newborn, this threw me off just a bit. Not an excuse, just a reality. I'm human. That really rubbed me the wrong way, especially coming from a conservative, self-described critic of wokeness, because sounds dangerously close to me like the reasoning behind microaggressions, trigger warnings, and safe spaces. She's saying that somebody else simply talking about a category she identifies with, parents, which is a hell of a lot of the planet. That's not even a niche category. She's saying so set her off, triggered her, put her in a state of feeling microaggressed that it affected her performance when she had to do her work. What is that if that's not somebody saying, I can't take a test because the culture constantly microaggresses me? I would have to throw that logic out. And even if you're feeling sorry for yourself, you can't reach for the same exact tools that the people you profess to dispute also utilize in situations you don't agree with.
It almost sounds like you're saying that perhaps the logic on all sides of this discussion is not impeccable.
It is not. But it actually forms the shape of a horseshoe when these people actually end up making the same arguments, but they think it's right for themselves, but not for the other. And
it's excuse making, isn't it? It's excuse making. Oh, I couldn't do it because this happened. And I want to be perfectly clear about something. I did not have my son to perpetuate my own narcissism. I had him so he can do chores for me when he's older. All right. I don't want to mow my own lawn. Should we talk about other stuff? Because we got a lot to talk about. A lot going on this week. We are things coming up on this podcast. We are going to try to quantify just how much the Oscars suck. That sounds like a challenge. We are going to try to figure out if Ron DeSantis' thoughts on Ukraine are about the war in Ukraine or about the war against Trump, who he's going to take on in the primaries, almost certainly. And we're also going to talk about how top universities are deciding to admit the next generation of overly ambitious twerps without the SATs. But first, let's talk about the big story of the week, Silicon Valley Bank. Thomas, how much of your money is in Silicon Valley Bank?
Thankfully, I have spent all my money. I've spent all my money.
That's the smart financial decision that people like Sue Zorman just won't talk about. As soon as it comes in, right back out the door. Just spend it on anything. Just run to a boat store, buy a jet ski. Drugs are always great. Get yourself a couple prostitutes. Just the second it comes in, goes straight back out. You are never susceptible to a market crash that way. Good financial advice.
I'm market proof. I mean, I'm renovating an apartment. Like, if you want to just not have money, not worry about losing money, your contractor will just call you up and tell you a figure that astonishes you after you agreed on a figure, and you still want your kitchen done. You have to pay it. So I have lost not a penny in the market.
Good work. Now personally, I have half of my money in a mayonnaise jar I buried down by the creek, and the other half in a pickle jar by the old oak tree, because that's what we call portfolio diversification. So I am also safe. But let's talk about this. So the interesting thing that happened is Silicon Valley Bank went under. The Biden administration is now saying nobody who deposited money at this bank is going to lose this money, even if you are over the $250,000 FDIC insurance limit. You are not going to lose your money at the bank. They are either going to find a buyer for the bank, or through extraordinary measures that I don't totally understand, they are going to find a way to make depositors whole. Not the people who ran the bank. People who ran the bank are screwed. They are going to, they had shares in the bank. Those shares are worth nothing. They are going to lose their jobs. They're not getting bailed out, but depositors are going to be made whole. And I feel like, I fear what this is going to lead to is a debate that will last from now until Election Day 2024 about, was this a bailout? Mm-hmm. We're just going to be debating, just as we debate the word wokeness, we're going to be debating the meaning of the word bailout for the next year and a half. God,
you just gave me a flashback of Benghazi or something like that, where it's just going to never, never going to stop hearing bailout, and I don't know, I'm not a libertarian. I would certainly like lower taxes, but I like living in a society where if shit goes off the rails, and it could effectively ruin people's lives far down the chain from the people that are actually responsible, that the government can step out and sometimes bail things out, even if some people who have a lot of money and you might not like also end up benefiting from that situation. I just like having, some safety measures in place. Also this was like, I noticed a journalist on Twitter, Eric Levitz, I think is his name, of New York Magazine, was noting that, like, he's just a journalist. He didn't have anything to do with Silicon Valley Bank, but the parent company of New York Magazine, Vox Media, banked at Silicon Valley Bank. And so, if they actually did lose their money, it looked like, all the way downstream to just like random journalists employed by a company that kept its assets in Silicon Valley Bank would lose their jobs. Yeah. So that can't be like a good solution. So thank God we have a government that steps in those, extreme circumstances.
I agree. I think this is the right thing to do. I mean, I'm far from an expert on banking regulation, but my layman's instinct is that this is the right thing to do, largely because they are trying to make sure there is no panic where other people who bank at mid-sized banks will think, oh my God, my bank's about to go under. I got to get my money out right now, hence causing other bank runs. They are trying to head this off at the pass. At the moment, this seems to be contained. It's just at the moment, Silicon Valley Bank and one other, whose name I forget. I think as a principle, you shouldn't make policy out of spite, right? That should not be your motivation for policy. So I do think some of the people who feel like just let them go under. They made a bad decision. Let them go under. And again, it's not the bank that's going to be saved here. It's the depositors. I think that's a bit of a spiteful opinion, because there are a lot of people downstream, like the people you just talked about at New York Mag, who would be facing big problems, or the people who deal with some of the businesses that banked at Silicon Valley Bank who would be facing problems. Their various vendors, contractors, all the way down to, the person who vacuums the carpet in the building. And I also think it's reasonable when you put money in a bank. Let's be honest. None of us do a ton of due diligence. None of us are like cracking open the bank's books and thinking, well, that's not how I would have invested that money. Like, I have put money in a bank because it was the closest one to my house.
That's how we all do our banking.
We all do it. So I don't see the depositors at Silicon Valley Bank as like greedy bad people. I think there's people who used the bank, right?
Depositors, yeah. I see the people running it as potentially suspect, but I don't know. Like Credit Suisse, a big, huge, important bank, had to be bailed out by the Swiss government just this week to the tune of $54 billion, 50 billion Swiss francs. I mean, that's enormous. But sometimes, the system falling apart. I remember 2008. I mean, that was the first time I lost all of my money, trying to buy an apartment, and at the exact time trying to close a mortgage as a young guy, using all of my savings at the exact time that Lehman collapsed, and really getting caught up in something I had nothing to do with, and just getting harmed in a way that, I'm not here to complain. Yeah. People got harmed a lot worse, but anything that can be done to mitigate the harm that happens to all types of people just trying to live their lives, trying to support their kids, trying to eat. I mean, I'm for that, even if some kind of nasty operators get away with a bit of, irresponsible actions in the process.
Yeah. I'm not even sure how much it was irresponsible versus just like dumb. It didn't work out. I mean, I just made a joke about portfolio diversification, and it seems like that is the thing they did not do, because they had all their money in fixed rate treasuries, or most of their money in fixed rate treasuries, and then the value of those treasuries went down when interest rates went up. It has been funny to me how much everybody is trying to blame the thing they already disliked.
That's the world
for this collapse. It's like the second people heard Silicon Valley Bank, there were some people on Twitter who went, crypto, this is a crypto thing. And believe me, look, I love bashing crypto. I think crypto is mostly, not entirely, but mostly a joke. And I would love to blame this on crypto. It's not because of crypto. Some people have been trying to blame this on wokeness, the New York Post, and an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. They're trying to blame woke. Yeah. They're like, oh, the bank had DEI initiatives. It's like, oh, yeah, it had DEI initiatives. That doesn't mean that the initiatives led to the
That was
failure.
my favorite. That was my favorite pet issue to blame the collapse on. Oh, this is because of wokeness. That's not to beat this dead horse, but please, we have to get new language. We have to get new terms.
Yeah, I thought it was. I thought it was a downright funny attempt to blame it on wokeness. The tone of that op-ed to me was like, wokeness? Like, can I make this dog hunt? Is this going to work? What if I float this? And it didn't really take, I don't think.
Let's have a moratorium on blaming anything on a word called wokeness. Let's just have a moratorium. A
word that nobody can define. People who think it's good cannot define it, or else won't define it.
To define
People
it.
who think it's bad can't
and publish trade hardcover books on the subject can't define it. Let's have a moratorium on this goddamn word.
Yeah, and especially in reference to a bank failure, which is already complicated enough. It's plenty complex. Let's not add.
Well, here's the thing, and as guys just talking on a podcast, nobody understands anything. The bankers don't understand a lot. I was just recently talking to one of the most famous and probably influential economists of his generation. Not somebody I know, but I was close enough physically to him to ask him some questions, and I left thinking, God, no one knows anything, man. Some people just have a lot more sophisticated vocabulary and terminology and experiences to employ. But in complex systems like banking, in trying to diagnose social phenomena like wokeness, we're all trying, I hope, to make good faith attempts to understand what's going on. But people trying to act like they can explain to you what exactly is going on in crypto or with, credit default swaps and things like this.
Yeah.
We need humility. And I say that as two guys just, talking about banking who are definitely in need of humility talking about that subject.
Well, yeah, and I hope we didn't say too much. I hope we were very clear about our shortcomings in this area, because I agree there are just some systems, certainly economics, which is I've dipped my toes in these waters. I always point out on my blog I'm not an economist. I'm an economish. I studied it. I know of it, but I don't have a PhD and I don't study it presently. But economics, it's just too big. These systems are just too big to get your head around. That's why nobody can beat the market. It's just too big of a system to get your head around. Weather would be another one. So many things, as much as we can figure out, and we know a lot more than our ancestors, but these things are just too big for any one person to have in their brain. And certainly the people at Silicon Valley Bank thought they knew what they were doing, but guess what? They did not. Even though I'm sure they spent their whole careers in banking. People mess this stuff up all the time.
I mean, that's the thing. Is like one thing you can count on is that people are going to keep messing up that thing they've spent their whole career doing.
Yeah, I mean, we're messing up this podcast right now, so there proves our point.
My career doing it.
Yeah. Speaking of people not knowing stuff, should we talk about college kids? People who think they know a bunch of shit but actually don't know anything. Can we talk about college kids, if that's okay? And you are a college professor, so
yeah, I'm also somebody that I have I have a strong view on the issue. I think you're headed towards about.
Okay, well, it is going to be the issue you think I'm headed towards because we talked about it before the podcast. I think it's okay to tell people that. I'm not actually surprising you with these topics. The SAT and the ACT, Columbia University and William & Mary College, are effectively ditching the SAT and the ACT. They are now test optional, which means you do not have to submit your SAT or ACT score with your application. You still can. This is a policy that a lot of universities went to during COVID. They said during COVID, well, this is temporary. It's a temporary measure that we're doing because of COVID. Of course, the SAT and the ACT are criticized heavily by many people. The most common criticism is that the test scores are stratified both by race and by income. A lot of people don't like the test, and one assumes, though we're forced to guess, but one assumes that this is largely behind the policy of Columbia University and William & Mary becoming test optional. Thomas, what do you think about all this?
So I actually feel very strongly about this. I found myself once on NPR debating the head of the College Board a few years ago, when they made
Can I interrupt? Is this when you froze and then somebody punched you? Is this that appearance, or was this a different time?
No, I didn't freeze in this. I was pretty astonished, and I was kind
and
of.
Nobody hit you? Ira Glass didn't clock you across the jaw in this appearance?
No, everybody was physically restrained. But
okay. Sorry to interrupt. I was wondering if you were calling back that incident, but sorry to interrupt. You were on NPR and you were saying.
I was debating the head of the College Board, David Coleman, a few years ago when they first rolled out the kind of the adversity dashboard that was to be taken into account. So, they were going to try to standardize, measure how much hardship any given test taker has had. So they add that to your actual merit-based score so that you can kind of readjust, so that admissions officers can have more criteria to take into account than how a student does on the test. So I objected to that off of the fact that I don't think you can measure people's adversity necessarily. I don't think you can standardize how hard or painful a life has been. I think that some poor people have advantages that some rich people don't have. I think there's lots of complexity and granularity in human lives. But, this was part of this march towards devaluing the idea of merit itself, which really ratcheted up after COVID, after the racial reckoning of 2020. And there have been explicit arguments that the idea of merit itself is functionally racist. And so the position I've always felt very strongly attached to as a descendant of African slaves in America who did not come from wealth, but whose parents really drilled into me that you can control your effort, you can control how hard you work, that the SAT was really when I couldn't control how good my high school was. I couldn't control that I had no network capital around me. I had never met somebody that went to Harvard. I had never met somebody that worked for the New York Times or anything that I could want to do. I had no social capital, but I did have this kind of capital that my parents gave me, which is that, you are your own capital and you will take this test. Your school sucks. They don't even offer AP exams. You haven't had a lot of chances to do extracurriculars, but you can go and you can do really well on an SAT test. And then you can take that to a college and you can show that you deserve to be there. And so for me, the SAT is really, that type of standardized test is the best tool that poor and disadvantaged and minority students have. Obviously, this is the case because poor Asian students and other ethnic minorities have utilized standardized testing to
they're kicking ass.
Dominate.
They're kicking ass.
Dominating upper class whites. Let's be frank. In any type of...
They're kicking my ass and yours, yes.
They are. Any competition that allows for standardized merit-based screening. So the idea that you're going to get rid of this and that's going to make it more equal or fair, I think is a joke. It's going to make it a lot easier for rich kids that have the right intangibles to get into schools that they already feel entitled to be in without having to go through the charade of pretending to, care about the standardized tests. It's going to be easier for schools to tell Asian Americans who they've been trying their best to lock out by basically demanding Asian applicants have a few hundred points higher of an SAT score than comparable applicants of other ethnicities. They're just going to be able to tell them that you lack a personality in your essay. I mean, we're going to get essays we're going to get gorgeously written essays of human striving written by ChatGPT. I mean, all of this is going to be a nasty world that is not actually going to be made more fair. I really feel strongly.
Yeah, I do. I wonder what ChatGPT is going to do to the essay. I have long felt, and I actually wrote about this in Persuasion, that the essay, of all the components of the college packet, the essay is the worst one, right? Because it's just a bunch of bullshit that your parents wrote. What's that?
As an essayist, I fully agree with you.
Okay. Thank you. And it's either your parents wrote it or the person your parents hired to wrote it. There are tutors who, specialize in this, and they can make your essay a lot better. And what is that if not access to something that you will have if you are upper middle class or outright wealthy that you're not going to have if you're poor?
Or
I thought you said
it becomes the kind of contest to uncover the worst thing that's ever happened to you and to hone that into a piece of testimony, which I think is also a bad incentive. That if you can just find a really bad event, you can then bring that to the stewards of really wealthy institutions who will shower you with a little bit of grace and largesse, as opposed to just working really hard, taking a test and showing, along with like your record of grades over the course of 4 years, that you're competent and should be there. I mean, of course, there's other factors to take into account, but the idea that you can get away with standardized measures of competence and that you can be more fair is hubristic. It's ridiculous. I think it's absurd on its face.
Yeah, there's a really good essay. Guest essay in the New York Times from 2021 called "When I Applied to College, I Didn't Want to Sell My Pain" by Elijah Megginson. He gets to this. Oh shit! It is a he, right? Elijah Megginson gets to this idea of selling your pain, which is what you're talking about when somebody is trying to factor in a hardship metric. And by the way, when you say have a hardship metric in the packet, my brain does go, okay, what's that about? Because I do understand, and it sounds like you and I have very similar backgrounds too, in that like I went to like a very whatever public school in a very whatever place. It was certainly, not like the school from The Wire, but it was also not a school. It was also not a school where everyone, I'm like you, like I didn't know anybody who went to Harvard. I didn't know anybody who worked for the New York Times or anything like that. It's just like not done. Everybody at my high school went to the Navy because it's the Norfolk area. So I understand, and I also understand that so many people had it so much tougher than my situation. I understand the impulse to say, okay, let's get something into the essay that does measure, like how hard your life is. Like I get that impulse, but I also do feel, as it sounds you do, that just how you going to measure that? How are you going to measure that? It is true that if you're from a poor family, okay, well then you didn't get to hire the SAT tutor, you didn't get to hire the essay tutor, you didn't get to hire the math tutor when you were having trouble in algebra or whatever. But maybe your parents loved you, maybe you actually had a great family life, and you can also be from a wealthy family where your parents are fucking nightmares and don't act like we haven't met that family as well. So yeah, a hardship metric, it is like, boy, it sounds tempting. I'm not totally sure how you do that. And you don't want people trying to market their pain as like, this bad thing happened, therefore I should get into college. It's just kind of sick.
That's right. I mean, one of the first things I realized when I finally got to a fancy school for undergrad was that some of the worst things I'd ever heard happening within a family or to an individual were from people that from the outside were quite extraordinarily privileged. I'm talking about like people dying, people being assaulted, like real serious emotional abuse, coldness, lack of love and support. I mean, I had never seen that around some of my friends who were economically disadvantaged to the extent I saw it around some of the wealthiest people I've ever met. So I just don't know. I'm not saying that all things considered, it's not an advantage to be wealthy, but I am saying that I don't know how you can put that into a dashboard, get rid of the SAT and then make a more fair entrance process. And this argument that's been floating around that the school board of Lowell High School in San Francisco brought forth the year after the racial reckoning, and that was quickly done away with last year. This idea that merit itself is racist. I think that's one of the most insulting things I've ever heard.
It's sick.
As a non-white.
I think that's a sick point of view. Yeah. I think that's sick and condescending. I think that's a sick condescending that the thing that liberals do is there is the implication that like they can't. I don't know. That's the thing that I always hear sometimes when liberals go on these diatribes about how merit is racist. Oh, they can't do it. We have to lower the standards. I find it sick. I find it insulting. I find it fucked up, and I don't think it's true.
And guess what? You're not.
As you pointed out, Asian Americans are doing great on these tests.
Yeah.
I think that's because a lot of Asian American kids grow up in a family where they say education is a priority, education is important, you should study up and do well on this test.
Our mutual friend Coleman Hughes pointed out a few years ago, there was an article in the New York Times about the standardized testing in New York City that screens students for the real good public schools like Stuyvesant and Bronx Science and Brooklyn Tech. And he pointed out that it was not at all, a thesis statement in the piece. It was just a throwaway sentence where the reporter said, these schools are dominated by Asian American students, often first generation, living in Queens and places like this, and they go to cram schools. And then the journalist wrote, oftentimes these classes are paid for by families skipping meals. And it's like, wait a minute. Okay.
So it's not just money. It's not just money.
Wait a minute.
Something's going on. If you're skipping meals, one assumes you're not wealthy if you're skipping meals.
Skipping meals, that's a choice. That's not an ideal society where people choose between meals and getting their kids necessary preparation or what they see as necessary preparation. But that is something more interesting going on than a discussion about privilege. And we have to be able to talk about that. And if you say that certain people in perpetuity cannot be expected to meet certain standards that other people do meet routinely, then you're basically saying that equality is impossible. And
which is the part that I think is fucked up and condescending. Yeah, I think that's fucked up and condescending. And I think it should also not be lost in this discussion that grades are stratified by income and by race.
God, yeah.
So you're getting rid of one metric under the justification that it is stratified, and you are therefore emphasizing another metric that is also stratified and other things that the essay, another part of the packet, which I think is subjective and dumb. The recommendation, which is another thing. It's like you're rewarding extroverts, and that's where I draw the line. Rewarding extroverts. I'm a committed introvert. I feel like my people are being discriminated against when you give more weight to the recommendation.
Would you say that if you heard someone was giving a lot of weight to the recommendation on a hot mic before an interview that you might collapse?
I wouldn't give the interview, Thomas, because I would be curled up in a ball in a corner of the room, rocking back and forth and sucking my thumb. How am I supposed to withstand such a horrible statement? I can't be expected to do anything for like a week after I hear something like that. I'm so
someone who identifies as a non-recommendation gatherer. To hear that talk? Whoa. Whoa.
I just am that fragile. And frankly, I'm feeling a little attacked right now. Frankly, Thomas, I'm feeling a little microaggressed by you. You said an interesting thing that I don't want to get lost here, which is you said, and I hope I'm getting the words about right. I hope I'm paraphrasing correctly. If I'm not, tell me. That you thought the SAT was maybe, you said like the best or the most important component of the packet?
It was the only one that was
better than grades, would you say?
It was, grades were not fully under my control in certain ways. I mean, I can even say that I think that, I had, I'll be completely honest. I dressed in certain ways, especially that I think in the 90s signaled to my white teachers that I was part of a kind of oppositional culture. And I think they made judgments about my competence based on the slang I used, based on how I dressed, based on who I socialized with, that they could bring to a larger assessment of how capable I was when they had subjective measures of grading my work. I did pretty well on grades, but all of these things came into play. None of that comes into play on the SAT test. I simply answered questions that I had prepared for, and that was the most control I could exert over how I would be judged. And so nobody required these kind of ideas of what Black masculinity looks like and should be able to achieve. I remember when I got into certain schools, some of my teachers didn't believe it. I remember when I applied to certain schools, some of my white teachers and guidance counselors said, whoa, I don't know if you should really be looking at, like, well, why not? I have scores that I should. So why are you projecting a judgment onto me of which school would be inappropriate for me to even send an application to? These things are real in interpersonal interactions. Also, last point about this, when I got to Georgetown and I was around kids coming from Andover and Stuyvesant and schools that have a culture of teaching students how to be good at school, I realized that I didn't know you were supposed to go and seek out teachers in certain ways at office hours and ask certain questions that signal that you know how school works. Those factors come into your grades. And when you come up in high schools like that, you already know that 4 years earlier, 6 years earlier. So the idea that grades actually offer like a better window, I think it's a joke. Also, some people are straight A students at really terrible schools.
Yes.
Like, let's be honest.
Yes.
An A is not an A is not an A is not an A. So
right, which it's always grades. Comparing grades, it's always apples to oranges because of that reason. Is it 3.7 at this school versus 3.4 at that school? Which is better?
It's ridiculous.
Very hard to say.
It's ridiculous. So
it's funny how our lives dovetailed, though, because as we mentioned on the podcast last week, we both ended up at Georgetown. We both ended up at Georgetown at about the same time, though we did not know each other while we were there. And it's interesting for you to talk about the SAT as a test that didn't know what you were wearing when you took the test, right?
Exactly.
It didn't know that you were wearing Timberlands and an NWA shirt or whatever. I don't know what you wore. Did you have cornrows back then?
Actually, I just realized this is one thing that I did wear. This is the only thing that fits me still because I was so upset it was small when I bought it. I used to wear massively oversized clothes, but this is a beloved sweater from my high school days. But I wore like massive Jinko jeans. I mean, I'm from New Jersey. I wore Timberland boots, Versace sunglasses to class. I mean, if I were a biology professor, I wouldn't really take me seriously either. I was wearing Versace sunglasses that I had turned into prescription lenses. It looked ridiculous because I was living a BET fantasy of a rap video.
It's so funny to think of you like that then, and then meanwhile 1,000 miles south of you in Virginia, I am at a conservative public high school with long hair and a Sonic Youth shirt and like ripped jeans, doing the exact same problem, except that I think that the mediocre grades my teachers gave me were totally fair because I was not doing a good job. I only ended up at Georgetown because I transferred in. I transferred in on the strength of my college grades.
Oh, but that's good
from
too.
The University of Oregon when I was freshman and sophomore.
Oh, go Ducks! There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with taking a year to actually acclimate to the college environment and then transferring to a school that you think better suits you. Oh, but it's exactly like you said. It's like no one knows what you're wearing when you're taking the SAT test. There was a time when we thought that was the height of equality. I'm thinking about the recent disputes over for like the New York Philharmonic, right? That you needed to have a curtain so that judges assessing the playing quality of musicians couldn't say, I don't think that woman played as well as that man. You just are playing, it's just a piano playing behind a curtain, and they can judge how well the instrument is being played. That move allowed many more women to get into the game than had been in the past when it was subjective. Now there have been arguments that I think are not so dissimilar from the argument to get rid of the SAT, that the screen's got to come down. We actually need to see the whole person playing the piano because there's not enough minorities getting through that blind screen.
Yeah, I think you are getting to what is.
Get into.
I think you are getting to what is the basic disagreement here, which is that you have people who like objective processes, where to the extent that you can measure something, and we acknowledge that especially when you're talking about college, it's difficult to measure aptitude, measure ability to succeed in college, but you do the best you can. Objective measures versus people who just want to go, fuck all that, just. Hire based on whatever traits I decide are the right ones to hire, whether it be gender or race or other factors. And I am pretty decisively, though it should be said not entirely. There's always an asterisk, but pretty decisively in the let's do it objectively camp. Yeah,
and let's try to do something that other countries do pretty well with similar resources and even fewer resources than we have. Let's actually try to make a social system where students have and citizens have opportunity from a young age so that, their life doesn't come down to what they do at age 16 or 17 on a standardized test, but let's try to actually have, universal pre-K and things like this. Like, let's have affordable daycare. Let's have actually decent public schools for all that aren't dependent on how much taxes your town takes in. I mean, just simple things that could allow more people to flourish that we refuse to do. And then we try to say, let's just wing it, take down the measures and just try to make up for all of these wrongs that have preceded a person's arrival at the application process. It's a ridiculous way of trying to engineer society.
Yeah, I agree. It should not be used as a cheat. You do actually need to fix society, not rig things on the back end and go, oh, we fixed it. No, you need to actually fix it for real. Completely agree. Hey, should we talk about Ron DeSantis in Ukraine? I think that we should. Can we? Because let me say this. We're not, neither you nor I are capable of delineating the exact right path forward on Ukraine. We covered this in episode 1. We're both cheering for Ukraine. We're both cheering for Ukraine in this one. But exactly what that means in terms of U.S. involvement, that can be hard to describe. What's a little easier to see here is what's going on politically. So here's what happened this week. Ron DeSantis put out a statement that he had read on Tucker Carlson's show. So right away, you're getting a sense for the flavor of statement that DeSantis is putting out, because he's putting it out on Tucker Carlson, who's the most pro-Russia public figure out there. And this statement basically laid out DeSantis's thoughts on Ukraine at the moment, it should be said, because they do seem to be somewhat different from his very hawkish pro-Ukraine positions he has staked out previously. Let me read this in part. In part, the statement says, while the U.S. has many vital national interests, securing our borders, addressing the crisis of readiness with our military, achieving energy security and independence, and checking the economic, cultural, and military power of the Chinese Communist Party, becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. Thomas, I think this is quite clearly Ron DeSantis trying to take some of Trump's base away from him, because Trump is about as pro-Russia of an American politician as you can find. This is, I think, DeSantis trying to steal some people who like that about Trump. Do you read it the same way?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And to the extent that it's, bringing a politician who potentially could be capable of averting the absolute catastrophe of a second Trump presidency, then I would say I'm almost willing to say I'm for it. Because I think that as bad as any outcome in Ukraine could be, it would actually be worse, not just for Americans, but for the global order, for Trump to get back in office. So as I think about DeSantis doing what he's got to do, messaging how he's got to do it, if it actually is to the end of staving off a resurgent Donald Trump, I'm almost willing to just grit my teeth and bear it. With that said, I find myself in the weird position of kind of missing neocons, just people I could at least say, I think,
go on,
patriotic. I think that they actually believe that some things are better than other things, as opposed to this new type of position from the right, which is almost again, the horseshoe, cultural relativism, or who's really to say?
Yeah.
Putin never called me a racist. And actually, I think I like Putin better than Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden. And who's really to say?
Yeah, I'll tell you the part of this statement that really jumps out at me is calling, I'll read the words again, interests involved becoming further engaged in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia. Territorial dispute? It's who can say where that border should be? This is an internationally recognized border. Territorial dispute.
They've got their side and the Ukrainians have their side. And, it's far be it from me to say.
I think, but for what it's worth, I think you're right about neocons, and I do not want to see them come back. But you are correct that I think they were patriots.
Yeah,
when I think of Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, they were patriots. They weren't. You wouldn't argue that they were actually really, really soft on the other side. I mean, the opposite really was true. You're right that it is very strange to have this element of American politics where it's like, you think Putin's kind of cool? What the fuck?
That's a very weird place for a substantial portion of Americans to be arguing from or to be voting from. And Putin might be not as bad as the other party that we're going to the polls against. I mean, it's a terrible.
That's bonkers. And by the way, in case people think we're manufacturing this out of whole cloth, let me read a quote from Tucker Carlson, who has banged this drum pretty loudly. From an episode last year, Tucker Carlson said, "It may be worth asking yourself, since it is getting pretty serious, what is this really about? Why do I hate Putin? Has Putin ever called me a racist? Has he threatened to get me fired for disagreeing with him?" It is saying like, okay, Putin, whatever you think of him, the woke people are worse.
It's literally, we're back on, it's not as bad as wokeness. It's insane. It's insane. Well, at least Putin's not woke. It's like, that's now the metric for judging international relations. And it is, I mean, Vladimir Putin became a kind of icon on the right for defending a kind of white virility and masculinity, or so-called, and taking a hard heteronormative stance against a kind of effete, decadent European American liberalism, and that actually before the invasion,
Frenchmen like yourself, say it. Frenchmen like yourself.
Let's just say it. French, francophiles like myself. He became kind of celebrated before the invasion by a segment of the alt-right and people like this who thought that he was defending Euro-Christian values and heteronormative values. And he was like the last bulwark against wokeness. I mean, we're back on that crap. It is actually, and the strangest thing about arguing from the center is I've had people, essentially putting these criticisms on me from the left, but I try to just be consistent and fair. There is such a thing as like the mind virus that actually makes you see the threat of wokeness around every corner, and to actually get into situations where you think Vladimir Putin starting the first land war on the European continent since World War II is better than pronouns being like in people's emails,
Yeah.
It's a crazy place we're at now.
You said mind virus. I think that's a good way to put it. I try to keep myself calibrated because I am someone, on the left, center left, however you want to characterize it, who does, talk about, again, wokeness is not my preferred term. I will say the religious left or, left illiberalism, whatever phrase you want to use. Wokeness is never my preferred phrase, but I do think there are things to be worried about there. I do write about them a fair amount. I actually write about them more than I might because I think that's where the interesting discussions are. I think that's where the interesting debates are. The discussion we just had about the SATs, I think these are things we need to parse.
Right.
Whereas a lot of, it's like Marjorie Taylor Greene does something. I'm not sure I need to spend my life reacting to Marjorie Taylor Greene. I'm pretty sure I know what I think about that lady. So I do talk about those things because I think they're worth talking about. But yes, it is very important to keep yourself calibrated, to keep things in perspective. And when you are thinking wokeness is a bigger problem than Vladimir Putin, who rolled tanks across an international border like the bad old days, I think that is a clear sign that you have lost the plot.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and I was just going to say, with the caveat that if you have to get that message out there to prevent Donald Trump coming back to power, I might just say that there are no good options here. But
okay, that's okay. That's interesting though. That's interesting though, because you're sort of it's a dangerous game, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we agree that a second Trump term would be a very, very, very bad thing. I have said, certainly on my blog, on various podcasts, I'll say it again here, I prefer any Republican who will respect the basic boundaries of liberalism, which is, open debate, free discussion, freedom of the press, extremely important, and just accept the results of the election. I prefer that candidate to Trump, and I have no qualms about saying it. I really will be rooting for that person. Ron DeSantis, I got to say, on free speech, Ron DeSantis' scorecard is real bad at this moment. And we talked about this in episode 1. He is not distinguishing himself as a defender of free speech. Will he accept the results of the election if he loses? Time will tell. We will find out a lot about Ron DeSantis as the primaries unfold. I do think it's extremely disturbing that there is this element of the Republican Party, which, as you said, it's sort of this Christian, masculine, anti-woke thing it's Putin, it's Viktor Orban, it's Marine Le Pen, and then in our country, it's Trump, sort of in that, Christian nationalist, something white, something area. I struggle for words quite clearly. It's fucked up that there are people who want to vote for that. And it sounds like you're saying if you can capture some of that and beat Trump, worth it. Am I reading you right?
Well, I'm saying Trump is such a singular perversion of our politics and such an unstable and really like sui generis threat to global stability and our standing in the world that I think that even racism and xenophobia and a really disgusting political culture, even playing into that, but preventing him specifically from taking power again, is the better choice of two terrible choices. And when you mention someone like Le Pen, she's pretty bad, but I mean, she looks positively really delightful compared to Donald Trump. And, she actually has a limit to what she can do in terms of, saying crazy shit. Like Donald Trump has no limit. And, I would say that even Le Pen doesn't say quite as disturbing things as Tucker Carlson can say. She's actually tacked more to the middle than where Carlson is willing to go.
Right. She certainly, for people who don't know French politics, and Thomas lives in France part-time, so I'm inclined to take his word for things. She has tacked to the center substantially, and is certainly farther to the center than her dad was by a long shot, correct?
Oh, very much so, to the point where he was, rooting for other candidates against her. But, Viktor Orban is really more of the disturbing model, I think, for what DeSantis kind of wants to style himself as, using the power of the state to rein in, private corporations, the media, to dictate what books can be. I mean, I think DeSantis is actually quite a threatening guy, but we know what Trump is. And so I think just knowing what Trump is, he will always be the more disturbing possibility.
He's one of the all-time greats. He's one of the all-time greats in terms of being terrible.
There's nothing comparable. There's just nothing comparable. Donald Trump would not even pretend in advance of the election to commit to accepting the results of a free and fair election. He wouldn't even do that basic thing.
Yes. And what he did was the most foreseeable consequence of someone's beliefs ever. He telegraphed it from miles and miles away that he was going to not accept the election if he lost. I will be very bummed out if we end up with the Republican Party, and we might already have it, where being Trumpist, even if you are not Donald Trump, is a requirement to win the nomination. If we get a version of DeSantis that does all the terrible illiberal things that Trump did, like Trump was always trying to throw his weight around to get the press to do what he wanted him to do. He was trying to, influence mergers because he didn't like CNN and things like that. Like that's bad stuff. I don't want to see that just become the norm. Ron DeSantis is not covered himself in glory in that regard. And God, if the contesting an election that's anywhere close just becomes the norm, boy, that's bad news. I was happy that there were not big problems with that in 2022. But that's also why I'm not prepared to say, well, I like DeSantis, I don't like him, but he's still better than Trump. because it's sort of DeSantis is going to tell us who he is.
Well,
So it's TBD. I will say there's plenty of room to be better than Trump and still real bad. I'll say that.
Oh yeah. I that's basically where I am. And then we've got, what's going on the left. I mean, what type of candidate is going to save us from either of these two gentlemen? So that's a discussion for another time.
That is the. Let's leave that for another time. Hey, let's talk about something that doesn't really matter. How about that?
Sure.
This is sort of our "Who's Thomas fighting with" on Twitter this week segment. Except it wasn't really a fight, was it?
I think there was real consensus here.
Oh, okay. Well, then why don't you describe this poll that you did?
I just asked people which they thought was worse, which was more useless, which was more difficult to be excited about, the Grammys or the Oscars, the night before, the day of the Oscars, I think. And it seemed that it was 55.5% to 44.5% that the Grammys are worse than the Oscars. And, I'm inclined to agree with that. I think both are unwatchable. I haven't watched either program in a very long time. I did like that Chris Rock Netflix special, and I did think again about that was the only time I've seen anything on the Oscars that I can remember in decades that actually like I thought it was like must see TV. Other than that, they're just worthless kind of events. I talked about this with some friends, and they one point that came up was that at least like you can be interested in what people are wearing. I guess women are dressed pretty interestingly at the Oscars, more interestingly than the Grammys. It's more of a thing. I think the after parties might be better at the Oscars, but are we moving towards a future where neither of these things really can command a significant slice of will Joe Rogan just have a bigger audience than the Grammys or the Oscars going forward? I mean, it seems like that's
possibly. Well, and the future may have arrived. We may already be there. Although the numbers for the Oscars were up this year after many years of them going down. They went up.
That makes me kind of pilled. So maybe my friends in the WhatsApp text group that swear that the slap was something that the Oscars put Rock and Smith up to is legit. Maybe that's the only way they could keep an audience coming back.
You think people watched again this year hoping somebody would get smacked?
I think that was the slap bump, yeah.
It could have been. Boy, now I'm wondering who they thought was going to get slapped and who they thought would do the slapping. It could have been certainly like you knew in Jimmy Kimmel's monologue he was going to reference the slap and it was going to be kind of fun, and he didn't. It kind of was because I didn't watch the. I didn't watch it either.
Because I can't watch it. I didn't watch the Oscars. I just ran the poll. A few thousand people responded that the Grammys suck more. Here we are.
What do you think? So, and I didn't watch it either, but I did watch Jimmy Kimmel's monologue. That was pretty funny. I watched it like on YouTube the next day. What do you think is driving the results of that poll? Why do people think the Grammys are even worse than the Oscars?
Because I think that, well, I was going to say that, you can't even, have confidence in the process of giving out awards, but can you really have confidence in giving out awards at the Oscars either? No. The Grammys are boring, I think. Now we get so much. You don't need to wait for an award ceremony to come around to see like the biggest stars perform or to get a glimpse of something that I think in a previous era you did need to wait for to see a big performance. Now you can just go on YouTube and you've got tons of stuff to look at. I think it's just the hold that type of television has on us is no longer what it was, or the television culture that we're all supposed to be looking at something at the same time. That no longer is where we are. I mean, those all seem like plausible explanations. Music also kind of sucks.
Is music? What about this? Is music more subjective than movies? Because there are a lot of movies that like most people will agree like that's a pretty good movie. Never everybody, but there are a lot of movies that do a lot of business and most people agree that's a pretty good movie. Jurassic Park, like most people have seen Jurassic Park, are like, yeah, it was worth my 2 hours. music, it's so subjective. There are artists that like their next album comes out and like you already know, like, yeah, I'm not going to listen to that. It's not my thing. 100% not what I'm in the market for. Is music more subjective than movies? And if so, does that make the Grammys more pointless than the Oscars? Because the Grammys, you already know, like, it's going to be a bunch of people who do music that I don't listen to.
That's an interesting point, but I think that people are consistently frustrated with the Best Picture selections, right? Isn't that like the one
As
thing
I
you
was
can
this year,
count on is like nobody thinks that the best. Very often, the movie that wins Best Picture is not what people actually think is the deserving candidate. I don't know. Music. I think there's something about the Grammys where it's out of touch with where the culture is in a way. Maybe what you're getting at is more like the Grammys. It took so long for them even to recognize that, you know, the most urgent and compelling and kind of influential music in the country and the world was hip hop. I mean, they were so slow to that, and even still, they haven't given many best albums like overall to a hip hop artist, and there's just been like a travesty of prioritizing a kind of outmoded form of pop music or other types of genres as opposed to recognizing where the culture really is right now. That maybe is more frustrating. Maybe genre is really the issue that makes the Grammys suck so much.
Well, if it's genre, I got a similar bone to pick with the Oscars, which is that comedies never get anything at the Oscars.
Right,
never have. Still don't. Now, these days, comedy movies don't exist. This is a trend in movies that I'm not sure if everyone has noticed. But I wrote a Substack post at one point where I crunched the numbers on this. Comedy movies are not a thing anymore. It has gone straight down for 20 years. It's actually something you can measure. Thankfully, there is data on this. You know, of the movies that are made every year, what percentage are comedies? It's less than half of what it was 10 years ago. So, okay, comedies don't exist. But even when they did exist, they never got any Oscar love whatsoever. Even like the great ones, you know, like Big Lebowski, Spinal Tap.
Yeah, Big Lebowski.
Like, these never did anything.
That should have been like Best Picture 2 years in a row or something like that. The Big Lebowski.
That has lived on.
Yeah.
In culture. Yeah.
But
so they've got enormous.
Some of the people were saying in response to the poll was that the Grammys are worse because the Oscars still at least have some semblance of artistic credibility, which is completely gone from the kind of pop music centric Harry Styles Grammy bullshit.
Who won? Did Harry Styles win Grammys this year?
I think he did. I didn't watch, but I think he give his award to female artists in general. Isn't that what
happened? I'm sure they were touched.
Can we check that Harry Styles gave his award?
I don't know. Why are you asking me?
Does it even matter? We even need to look that up?
It surely does not.
If he didn't,
although I am interested, I'm gonna Google Harry Styles gives Grammy. I need to find out if this is
my daughter's favorite artist, so I feel a little bit bad trashing him. She and her class.
Does she listen to this podcast? She's probably going to listen to the Ron DeSantis Ukraine segment, right?
But she's just going to turn it off.
Because she's how old?
9. She loves Harry Styles.
Okay. Yeah. Now, I should not be listening to the same music as a 9-year-old girl, right? So the fact that I don't listen to Harry Styles or anything about him, this is the way things should be, right?
Except sometimes these 9-year-olds are on to game. Like they'll listen to Travis Scott. They're listening to stuff that I don't think they should be listening to. They're listening to Central C. They're listening to Doja Cat and stuff. Yeah, it's kind of it's weird.
You know who I listened to when I was 9 years old? I'll give you a hint. He's a close personal friend of yours.
Of mine.
Yes. Come on, man. We talked about this last week. MC Hammer, the fourth face on Black Intellectual Mount Rushmore. When you met with yourself, Coleman Hughes, Camille Foster, and MC Hammer was the fourth member of the group. I loved MC Hammer when I was.
I loved him too. I had posters on my wall. I was hugely into Hammer time.
He was too legit to quit.
That was
fact check.
That was a banger.
Was.
That was a big song. I think, man, we're back. We're talking about MC Hammer. Should we wrap it?
I think when you're talking about MC Hammer, it's time to wrap it up. Hey, have a better week next week than you had this week. I'm interested to see who you get in fights with and whether we'll find the definition of wokeness. One thing that's exciting is we don't know who that next fight is going to be with, but we know it's coming. It could be anybody, but you know who it's not going to be probably is MC Hammer, because you two are like two peas in a pod. All right, man. Take care. Talk to you next week.